重すぎる、重すぎる。不格好だ。花がでかくて偶然飛んでいるような機械だ。
Before dawn, over the Solomon Islands, a Japanese pilot sees the new American fighter for the first time and laughs. It looks too long, too heavy, too awkward. A machine with a nose so large it seems to be flying by accident. Its wings bend downward, then upward, like a bird that was built wrong. Its landing gear hangs from those strange gull wings like stilts. It does not look elegant. It does not look Japanese. It does not look dangerous. The pilot banks closer. His Zero is lighter, cleaner, more graceful. In every old lesson of Pacific air combat, he should own this sky. Then the American fighter stops turning with him. It drops, not falling, choosing, and the whole fight changes shape in 3 seconds. The Japanese pilot shoves the stick forward to follow. The Corsair is already gone, not lost, gone in the way only a much faster machine disappears. A second later, it is above him again, not where it should be, not where any American fighter that big should have been able to get. The 650 calibers open together. One burst, short, flat, violent. Another Zero breaks apart in the morning haze. No warning. No long turning duel, no chance to recover the rhythm. On the American side of the sky, a Marine pilot does not cheer. He is too busy climbing back into the sun. He knows the next Japanese pilot still thinks this fight belongs to him. That mistake is about to cost Japan more than one airplane. It is about to cost them a whole way of reading the sky. By the time the Corsair reaches the South Pacific, Japanese pilots already have a clear image of the American fighter pilot they prefer to fight. They prefer the man in a machine that wants to turn. The man who sees a Zero and accepts the invitation. The man who makes air combat personal. That pattern had worked often enough to feel almost natural. Early war Japanese naval aviation had earned its confidence honestly. The Zero climbed beautifully, turned tightly, and punished anyone foolish enough to play by its rules. In China, over the Philippines, over the Netherlands East Indies, elegance and aggression had often been enough. The Americans, from the Japanese point of view, kept arriving in aircraft that looked compromised, too heavy, too armored, too dependent on engines rather than touch, too industrial, too blunt. The Wildcat had already taught some painful lessons. But even then, many Japanese veterans still believed the right pilot could solve almost anything in the sky. Then the Corsair appeared, and at first glance, it looked ridiculous. Not weak. Ridiculous. The long nose made carrier officers uneasy. The bent wings looked like a design argument nobody had finished properly. The cockpit sat far back, as if the pilot had been pushed away from the propeller by force. It looked like something built by a mechanic rather than a poet. On Guadalcanal, Marines and naval officers had their own reasons to distrust it. The F4U Corsair was brutally fast, yes. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp producing around 2,000 horsepower, it could break past 400 miles per hour in level flight, faster than anything most Marine squadrons had yet flown in combat. But speed alone does not win trust. The aircraft bounced hard on carrier decks. Its long nose made visibility awkward during landing. The cockpit sat so far back that some pilots felt as though they were flying from the wrong end of the fuselage. On paper, it looked like a monster. On approach, it behaved like one too. That is why, in the early Pacific War, the Navy hesitated to use it at sea. So the Marines inherited the airplane first. Not because it was easy, because someone still had to figure out what it really was. At Henderson Field, where mud, coral dust, and fatigue ruined almost every romantic idea men brought with them into war. What it really was became a practical question. Could it climb under pressure? Could it dive without shaking apart? Could it take punishment? Could young pilots survive in it long enough to stop wrestling the airplane and start fighting the enemy? Master Technical Sergeant Joe Mallory, a fictionalized crew chief built from a dozen real men like him, had no interest in philosophical answers. He cared about plugs, leaks, cowling panels, hydraulic lines, and whether an aircraft came back with fewer holes than the last one. To him, the Corsair was not a legend, it was work. Every morning before first light, Mallory walked the line with a flashlight hooded in his palm. He tapped panels, checked tires, ran a hand along ammunition access plates. He knew the F4U's ugly qualities better than any pilot did. He knew how much oil it could spit, how hot the engine liked to run, how rough the prop wash felt when the throttle came up. He also knew something the pilots were only starting to understand. When the engine settled and the machine got airborne cleanly, there was nothing clumsy about what came next. The Corsair accelerated the way a threat accelerates, not gracefully, decisively. First Lieutenant Tom Rayner, another representative fictional pilot, had been trained well enough to know not to trust appearance in war. He trusted it anyway. The first time he walked toward a Corsair at dawn, helmet under his arm, he thought the aircraft looked like it should belong to someone more experienced than him. It looked too much like a promise. Rayner had flown lighter training aircraft before the war and had once imagined fighters as nimble instruments. The Corsair was not nimble in the way he meant. It felt muscular. It needed more of everything. More runway, more throttle, more attention, more respect. And like many dangerous things, it punished uncertainty before it punished ignorance. His squadron commander, Major William Geese, real and very much respected, did not encourage poetry in the ready tent. He talked speed, altitude, discipline. Do not turn with a zero if you can avoid it. Use your climb when you own it. Use your dive, because nothing the Japanese have can follow forever. Hit hard. Keep moving. That doctrine mattered because the Corsair was not entering a vacuum. Japanese pilots did not simply meet American aircraft one by one like duelists in folklore. They met habits, formations, altitude choices, and tactical temperaments. A fighter's reputation grew not only from its engine and guns, but from how its pilots learned to think with it. The Corsair was about to teach a new style of thought. On the Japanese side, Sub-Lieutenant Kenji Sato of the 204th Air Group, another dramatized representative figure, had seen enough American aircraft to trust pattern recognition. Big American fighters usually meant two things: poor turning, heavy armament. That combination had to be respected, but it did not have to be feared if the fight became intimate. Sato had survived because he made fights intimate. He preferred to cut inside a man's expectation, preferred the slow tightening circle, preferred the moment when an opponent discovered too late that lift, momentum, and nerve were no longer enough to escape. That is what the Zero had given its best pilots: control over the personal terms of a dogfight. When reports began mentioning a new American fighter with bent wings and a giant engine, Sato heard the same judgments from multiple men. Fast, perhaps. Powerful, perhaps. But too big. Too nose-heavy. Too American. In war, confidence often survives longer than evidence. The first important mistake Japanese pilots made about the Corsair was not underestimating its speed. Many noticed that quickly. The first important mistake was assuming speed would still lead into the kind of fight they understood, that if the big American machine turned at all, it would eventually be forced to turn with them. That assumption would not last the morning. The mission that changed everything began like many missions in the Solomons did, with men exhausted before takeoff. The island air was already warm. Ground crews moved with the precision of people too tired to waste motion. Engines coughed, caught, and settled into hard thunder. The pilot's orders were simple enough. Climb, intercept, break up the raid, come back if possible. Joe Mallory helped secure Tom Rainer into the cockpit and slapped the fuselage twice, the way he always did. No speech. No lucky joke. Just the same 2 slaps. Rainer taxied out with the heavy tail low, nose blinding half the horizon. For a moment, the Corsair looked almost comic again, snaking across rough ground like a machine that did not trust the earth. Then the throttle came forward. The nose steadied. The big propeller bit air hard enough to change the whole mood of the airstrip. The Corsair was no longer awkward. It was committed. Sato was already higher when his formation made visual contact. He saw the Marines below and felt immediate relief. The silhouettes were unmistakably strange. The wings were wrong. The proportions were wrong. He thought what many Japanese pilots thought when first seeing the aircraft clearly. So that is the new American fighter. It did not look like a knife. It looked like a hammer. The distinction seemed favorable. Hammers win by impact. Knives win by touch. In the sky, Japanese veterans still believed touch mattered more. Rainer heard the call in his headset before he saw the Zeros. High right, keep your speed. The warning came from a veteran who already understood something the rookies did. Not the Corsair's first real weapon was not the gun battery. It was speed held in reserve. Lose that, and you became another American pilot, asking the wrong plane for the wrong answer. The first Japanese pass came in clean. Sun behind them, altitude advantage. Classic. The sort of opening that had broken weaker formations before. One Corsair banked too soon and nearly offered his tail. Rainer expected to feel panic. Instead, he felt the airplane surge as he shoved power forward and dropped the nose. The acceleration shocked him. Not because he had never read the numbers, because numbers on paper never feel this physical. Sato followed one Marine into the beginning of a turn, and knew immediately the aircraft below him was behaving differently than expected. The American was not tightening with desperation. He was falling away with intention, trading angle for speed like a man following instructions he trusted. For a second, Sato believed he had forced a retreat. Then the Corsair climbed out of the dive much faster than a retreating machine should have been able to manage. Major Gisa's section entered from above and left, not circling, slashing. The 650 caliber guns in each Corsair did not need a long, theatrical tail chase. They needed only a crossing chance, or a brief head-on window. The bent-wing fighter was teaching its pilots to think in passes, not duels. That change was more dangerous than the aircraft itself. Rainer saw his first Zero die, almost accidentally. A Japanese fighter pulled after one of the Marines, expecting the usual turning extension. Gies came down from offset altitude, fired a burst so short it sounded unfinished, and the Zero rolled over trailing flame. Rainer did not even have time to admire the shot. Another enemy fighter was already on him. Sato tried to reset the fight. That was what good pilots did. One surprise meant little. Battles breathed. Men recovered. The Americans might have speed, but speed can be bled away. Force them to climb too steeply, turn too early, react too often, and their big machine will finally admit what it is. He went after a second Corsair with that thought in his head. The problem was that the second Corsair was thinking the same way Gies was. It refused the invitation. Dove slightly. Rolled quickly. Came back high. That roll rate, once the speed built up, was one of the Corsair's nastiest truths. Pilots who assumed the aircraft's size meant sluggish response found it could reverse direction faster than they wanted when the energy state favored it. The bent-wing brute was beginning to dance. On the ground, Mallory and the other mechanics could not see the whole geometry. They saw streaks, flashes, tiny silver turns above a line of palms and cloud. But they knew when the rhythm changed. Old fights with wildcats had often looked tangled. This one looked like hammer blows. In, out, in again. A Japanese wingman named Hideo Morita, another representative figure, felt the first real stab of unease when a Corsair he had expected to overtake simply opened the distance. Not dramatically, effortlessly. His Zero was not slow. Few aircraft in the Pacific felt fast enough to shame it. Yet the American seemed to stretch away exactly when he should have been cornered. Morita broke off before gunnery range became mutual range. He hated himself for doing it. That small act mattered, because once a pilot breaks off from confidence rather than damage, the whole engagement changes. He begins asking questions. Why could the aircraft extend like that? How far can it dive before I lose control trying to follow? What happens if the American stops turning and starts choosing every vertical movement instead? The first fear is rarely fear of death. It is fear of not understanding the machine in front of you. Rayner nearly died in the same minute. He focused too long on a damaged Zero and let another one slide onto his rear quarter. He heard warning calls, jerked the Corsair into a hard move too low and too tight, and felt the aircraft shudder its disapproval. For one instant, he had done exactly what Geese told them never to do. He had tried to save himself with a turning response. Then, instinct failed him in the best possible way. He pushed forward instead. The Corsair dropped. Sato, watching from above, saw what should have been a mistake become a new kind of problem. The big American fighter went downhill so aggressively that the Zero behind it could not follow without risking control and structural failure. The dive angle widened, airspeed spiked, and the whole fight slipped out of the traditional Japanese pattern. The American had escaped not by outturning, by refusing to remain available. That refusal defined the engagement. Again and again, the Corsairs rejected the dogfight Japanese pilots expected to inherit. They climbed when there was advantage to climb. They passed through the fight when there was value in speed. They fired hard and brief. They used altitude as savings, not scenery. They looked crude only to men still evaluating the wrong category. In a turning contest at low speed, the Zero remained terrifying. That did not change this morning. What changed was how often the Corsair allowed the fight to remain low speed. Japanese pilots were used to making that decision for the enemy. Now the enemy had arrived in an aircraft that stole the decision back. Major G's cut across the formation and called for discipline, not heroics. No circles. No circles. Make one pass and reset. It was the kind of order some younger pilots hated because it sounded less glorious than combat was supposed to sound. It was also the correct order for the aircraft they were in. The Corsair could kill by mobility of another kind. Fast climb, fast roll, devastating dive, and brutal return speed. Sato watched one of his own men make the fatal choice. The pilot latched onto a withdrawing Corsair and pursued too long into the descent, convinced that the heavier American machine must eventually become predictable. Instead, the Corsair pulled out with authority, rolled through a new axis, and its wingman crossed the Japanese fighter's path with enough .50 caliber fire to tear the decision open. The Zero vanished into cloud and smoke. No one saw it hit water. Everyone knew. That was the moment Mockery died, not across the whole Japanese air arm at once, not by formal order, but inside the minds of the men actually fighting. The laughter was over. The Corsair could no longer be filed under awkward American substitute. It had become a new species of threat. Rayner scored his first real hit in the battle, almost by accident and training combined. He came out of a shallow dive, saw a Zero crossing left to right, and resisted the urge to overcorrect. In lighter fighters, he might have tried to sit behind the target. In the Corsair, with closing speed that felt almost rude, he only needed one disciplined burst. 6 guns opened. The Japanese fighter snapped smoke. Raynor kept climbing. That decision, to keep climbing instead of staring after the target, was the moment he became dangerous. The Corsair did not forgive emotional flying. Once its pilots stopped trying to prove superiority through pursuit, the airplane turned into something colder. It stopped inviting combat stories about artistry and began producing combat stories about control. Japanese veterans could work around artistry. Control was harder. On the ground, Mallory saw two Corsairs returning from one pass high overhead, climbing back into the sun instead of tangling low over the water. He understood the meaning before any debrief. They were finally flying the aircraft as an aircraft, not as a replacement for something else. That mattered more than one individual kill ever could. Morita, still alive and suddenly much more cautious, tried one last tactic he trusted. He faked disengagement, then pulled back in sharply against a Corsair he thought had become complacent. Against earlier American fighters, that kind of sudden re-entry often bought the Japanese another chance. The enemy pilot would assume space meant safety. He would relax his angle discipline and accept a slower, more personal engagement. The Corsair pilot did something else. He rolled, dived slightly, and outran the trap. Morita felt the cold truth then. This new fighter did not merely possess speed, it possessed speed the Americans had already learned to trust. That distinction decides wars. A great machine flown timidly remains half-used. A flawed machine, flown intelligently, can be murderous. The Corsair was neither flawed in the old way nor timidly handled any longer. It was becoming coherent. The battle widened. American sections spread and reformed. Japanese fighters kept trying to force individual contests, and finding those contests dissolving into vertical passes and crossing fire. The sky grew busier, louder, and less interpretable. Yet inside that confusion, one pattern repeated itself enough times to leave scars in memory. Every time a Japanese pilot thought the Corsair had accepted his terms, it escaped. Every time he let the Corsair choose the terms, someone died. Sato finally got his own firing chance. One Marine pilot came off a climb too slowly and gave him a fleeting stern angle. Sato took it, fired, and saw strikes along the Corsair's fuselage. The American aircraft lurched. Good. There. Proof. The machine could still be hurt. It still bled like steel and oil. Then it kept flying. Not gracefully, but decisively. That may have disturbed him more than missing. The Corsair was not invulnerable. It was simply robust enough to continue being dangerous after damage that might have ended more fragile aircraft. Armor, structure, and engine power all combined to buy American pilots something Japanese pilots had learned to deny so efficiently in the early war. Another chance, another 5 seconds, another climb, another pass. That margin is everything in air combat. Raynor saw the damaged Corsair in question, climbing away, smoke light but visible, and expected it to leave the fight. Instead, the pilot rejoined from high left 3 minutes later and nearly shot down the Zero that had hit him. The message spread without anyone saying it plainly. You might wound these aircraft and still not remove them from the sky. That is a demoralizing lesson for a fighter pilot. Japanese aviation had enjoyed an early war moral advantage built on anticipation. Many Allied pilots entered combat already half convinced they were in inferior aircraft. Japanese pilots felt that and spent it well. The Corsair began stealing that advantage in the opposite direction. Once Marines believed the machine could outrun, outdive, outroll, and often outgun what it faced, their own behavior changed first. Then Japanese behavior changed in response. Sato noticed that change before the fight ended. The Americans were not only surviving, they were becoming assertive in a new manner. Not wild, not reckless. Assertive because their exits were credible. A pilot flies differently when he knows he can leave a bad angle without begging the enemy's permission. That confidence is invisible in manuals, very visible in combat. The Marines' 650 caliber guns mattered in a particular way too. Not every encounter gave them a prolonged tail pursuit. The Corsair seldom needed one. The aircraft's speed meant gunnery windows were often brutally short. But when a burst connected, it connected with industrial force. Japanese pilots were used to fighting aircraft that needed longer confirmation. The Corsair's confirmation could be immediate. 1 accurate second was enough. At the far edge of the engagement, 1-0 tried to evade by dropping toward the sea and forcing an overshoot. A Marine lieutenant anticipated it, stayed high a fraction longer, then used the Corsair's nose authority in the dive to slash through the Japanese aircraft's path without ever trying to sit comfortably behind it. The Zero exploded in spray and smoke, so suddenly that even the Americans nearby sounded stunned over the radio. The Corsair was teaching them cruelty by efficiency. Morita wanted to believe the battle was an exception. One bad morning, one unfavorable set of positions. But even as he thought it, he watched another bent-wing fighter climb through a vertical slice his own Zero could not match at that speed and altitude without bleeding too much control. The Americans had found the place where horsepower, structure, and pilot temperament met. It was not a small place. It was a whole style of combat. On Guadalcanal, the ground crews eventually heard the shift over the radios. The younger pilots stopped sounding hunted. They started sounding busy. There is a difference between fear and workload. Fear shrinks language. Workload sharpens it. Mallory listened to clipped bearing calls and gun reports and realized that the Corsair's pilots were no longer talking as men trapped in the enemy's game. They were talking as men processing their own. That was new. The battle did not end in some perfectly American triumph. The Japanese were still good, still dangerous, still capable of punishing mistakes. At least one Corsair came home shot up. Another nearly did not come home at all. Men still sweated into their harnesses and missed things they should have seen. Good fighters do not become legends in one easy morning. They become legends by surviving a hard one. Sato withdrew from the engagement with fuel low and certainty lower. He had not become afraid of the Corsair in the childish sense. He had become professionally wary. That was worse. Fear can be shouted down. Wary men adapt their whole flying philosophy. By the time he was landing, he had already revised 3 assumptions about the aircraft. Too big to worry about. Wrong. Too awkward to fight vertically. Wrong. Too easy to pressure into a turning response. Very wrong. Back on the American strip, Raynor climbed out of his Corsair shaking harder than he had in the cockpit. That is how delayed fear works. In battle, the body rents itself to function. On the ground, it collects payment. Mallory looked once at the gun streaks, the punctures near the fuselage, the heat radiating from the engine, and then at the pilot's face. "Well," he said, "now you know." Raynor nodded. He did. The debrief was not sentimental. Major Guise cared about one thing first: had the men obeyed the aircraft? Not whether they were brave, not whether they chased a famous kill, whether they had flown the Corsair as the Corsair needed to be flown. The answer, imperfectly but clearly, was yes. Stay fast. Avoid flat turning duels. Use height. Use the dive. Make the enemy solve too much at once. This was doctrine becoming instinct. On the Japanese side, the debrief carried a different energy. Sato and the others still believed the Zero was a superior turning fighter. They were right. That fact had not changed. What had changed was the usefulness of the fact. A superior turn only matters if the enemy consents to remain in the kind of fight where turning decides everything. The Corsair had refused that consent repeatedly. That was the insult. Japanese pilots began describing the American aircraft in new language. No longer only awkward. No longer only oversized. Now they mentioned speed first. The dive next. Firepower always. Some complained about its resilience. Others about the way it could vanish downward, and return from a different piece of sky. A few still mocked its appearance, because pilots are human, and contempt is often a mask. But the contempt had acquired an edge. Raynor learned something else in that first real fight. The Corsair did not make him a better pilot by magic. It punished bad instincts and rewarded cold ones. That is a harder gift than glamour. In a more forgiving aircraft, he might have gotten away with emotional decisions longer. In the F4U, each wrong decision arrived amplified by speed and mass. Survive that schooling, and the aircraft gave back extraordinary things. Fail it, and it exposed you. Over the next weeks and months, Marine Corsair squadrons would pile evidence on top of that morning. Pilots like Kenneth Walsh and others would prove the aircraft could be more than a fast anomaly. It could be dominant in the right hands. But the first real shift in Japanese perception happened before the statistics became famous. It happened in one engagement where the old read on the sky stopped working. Sato carried one particular image away from the battle and never fully lost it. A Corsair he had expected to trap rolled out of a turn, dropped slightly, accelerated with humiliating ease, and then returned from above like a machine, with a second opinion about gravity. That moment offended his whole training because it suggested the fight no longer belonged to the more graceful aircraft. It belonged to the aircraft that chose when grace mattered. The Americans, meanwhile, began losing a different kind of fear. Their old fear had not only been of Japanese pilots. It had been of being technically trapped by the wrong airplane. The Corsair began freeing them from that mental position. A Marine in an F4U did not have to think first about what he could not do. He could begin by thinking about what he could impose. That change is enormous, even before it becomes visible to the enemy. Mallory saw it on the line before any intelligence summary could have captured it. Pilots walked toward the Corsairs differently after that first fight. Not swaggering. Worse than swaggering. Calm. Men who believe in a machine work more quietly around it. They stop bargaining with it and start planning through it. Ground crews notice such things because they watch the distance between cockpit and runway every day. Confidence has a posture. Morita, in contrast, found himself scanning for Corsairs differently in later sorties. Not every American silhouette worried him equally. The bent-wing one did. He stopped assuming that diving after one would end with a Japanese advantage. He stopped expecting a long pursuit to rip the fight open in his favor. He began respecting the possibility that any Corsair with enough altitude could be setting a problem rather than escaping one. Once a pilot changes his first assumption, the whole war tilts. The Corsair's 6-gun battery deserves its own dark kind of respect here. Japanese fighters had always been vulnerable to concentrated heavy machine gun fire. What made the F4U's firepower so upsetting in practice was not just the weight of the burst, but how suddenly the platform delivering it could arrive. Speed created the angle. Power stabilized the exit. The enemy experienced not a duel, but an event. That is harder to defend against psychologically. Raynor would later describe the aircraft in a way no engineer would love, and every pilot would understand. It flew mean. That was crude, but close to true. The Corsair did not flatter indecision. It encouraged choices made with force, and then rewarded them by making them harder for the enemy to answer. A lighter, more elegant fighter might let a pilot negotiate. The Corsair preferred verdicts. Japanese pilots learned that the hard way. Somewhere in that campaign, one old hierarchy began dying. For too long, American naval and marine aviation had entered combat under the burden of proving it could survive the Zero's world. The Corsair helped reverse that burden. Now Japanese pilots had to prove they could survive the Corsair's world. A world of slash attacks, vertical repositioning, hard dives, brutal bursts, and disengagements that were not admissions of weakness, but part of the kill sequence. That is a strategic emotional reversal. Not every Japanese officer understood it immediately. Some blamed tactics, some blamed altitude, Some blamed pilot errors. They were all partially correct. That is what made the shift harder to confront. The Corsair did not defeat the Zero in one clean ideological category. It defeated assumptions by changing the geometry in which categories mattered. A man could still praise the Zero's turn and lose the fight anyway. War hates purity that cannot adapt. At dusk, that same day, Mallory found a mechanic from another section running a hand along a Corsair's bent wing and saying half to himself, "Ugliest pretty thing I ever saw." That was about right. The aircraft had not become graceful by changing shape. It had become graceful by imposing logic on the chaos around it. The same wings that looked absurd, parked in coral dust, had become predatory in the vertical. A reputation was being born. Sato's superiors would eventually note growing losses and changing combat reports. Intelligence sections would collect impressions. Pilots would pass informal warnings. The enemy's new fighter was faster than expected, stronger in the dive than expected, more difficult to pin into old combat patterns than expected. Individual comments do not make doctrine overnight, but doctrine begins with men coming home unsettled. Sato was unsettled. So were many others. Raynor, meanwhile, spent half the evening replaying his mistakes. This mattered too. American aviation improved, not only because its new machines were better, but because enough of its surviving pilots were willing to analyze themselves honestly inside them. He had turned too hard once, chased too long another time, lost altitude discipline in the middle phase. Geese tore into those errors without mercy. The criticism felt like trust. It meant the aircraft deserved better. That relationship between airplane and pilot is how legends really form. Not from a single dramatic victory, but from a loop. The aircraft reveals a new possibility. The pilot survives it. The squadron teaches it. The enemy feels it. The next fight begins one step farther down the new road. The Corsair's first meaningful engagement in marine hands mattered because it completed that loop quickly and publicly in the air. Japanese pilots had now felt the aircraft at full intention. Morita would later say to another pilot, in words no American heard, that chasing the Corsair felt like chasing a fall that could think. It was an elegant way to describe something brutal. The F4U's most disorienting quality in combat was how intelligently it used descent. Dives were not desperation. They were leverage. A Japanese pilot following down found himself entering the wrong mathematics: compressibility, speed, closure, exit angles, and often abandoning the chase before the American did. That is humiliation by physics. On the ground, the Marine squadron's mood lifted without becoming foolish. There is a dangerous kind of confidence, and a useful kind. Useful confidence says the aircraft can do this if I do not betray it. Dangerous confidence says the aircraft can save me from myself. Guise and the veterans fought hard to preserve the first and kill the second. The Corsair was powerful enough to tempt arrogance. Good leaders refused it that luxury. That discipline kept the aircraft lethal. The Japanese did not stop being formidable because of one engagement. That would make the story too easy. The Zero remained dangerous. Japanese pilots remained skilled. Mistakes in a Corsair could still get a Marine killed in very short order, yet one battle can change what men expect the next battle to feel like. After that morning, Japanese pilots no longer looked at the bent-wing American fighter and saw only awkwardness. They saw unanswered speed. That is often how battlefield reputations begin, not with statistics, but with emotion attached to silhouette, the shape of the wings, the note of the engine, the direction it preferred to escape, the rate at which it returned, the short, savage length of its firing passes. By the time official histories summarize these things, the pilots who mattered had already learned them in fear. Raynor slept badly the following night, which is to say, he slept like a man who had finally met the war in the aircraft he would now have to trust against it. He dreamed not of victories, but of the moment his Corsair had gone downhill and come alive under him with such force that the fight itself had seemed to widen. In the dream, he felt the same recognition he had felt in real life. This airplane is not asking me to prove it belongs. It is asking whether I do. Sato, elsewhere, dreamed of the opposite. He dreamed of a target he had already solved, turning into a different problem while he was still inside the first one. The technical details shifted when memory replayed them, but the insult remained unchanged. The American had not won by becoming more graceful. He had won by making grace answer to power, timing, and refusal. That thought would stay with him longer than any single casualty report. Later in the war, the Corsair would become famous enough that men would forget how strange it once looked. That is what victory does to design. It edits memory. The bent wings stop seeming bizarre and begin seeming inevitable. The long nose stops seeming awkward and begins seeming noble. The hard landings, the deck troubles, the maintenance headaches remain in records, but shrink in popular imagination. Yet on the first mornings that mattered, none of that inevitability existed. Only doubt did. That is why one engagement mattered so much. Not because it settled the whole Pacific Air War, because it shattered the first lazy judgment before that judgment could harden into doctrine. If Japanese pilots had been allowed to treat the Corsair as merely another oversized American mistake for months, they might have built false confidence around it. Instead, the aircraft introduced itself with contradiction. Ugly and fast, big and agile in the right envelope, heavy, yet terrifying in the vertical. Contradictions linger in combat memory. Mallory remembered the debrief ending with a line from Geese that few men laughed at, though it was delivered dryly. "She's not pretty," the major said, "but she doesn't need to be." That line captured more than a mechanic's affection ever could. American war production rarely cared whether a machine inspired admiration on first sight. It cared whether enough training, enough horsepower, and enough reliability could turn that machine into battlefield authority. The Corsair was American in that very specific way. Sato's last visual memory of the engagement was of one Corsair climbing away into brighter cloud with a damaged wing root and still enough authority in its movement to make pursuit look foolish. Some aircraft invite attack, some punish it. He realized, too late for that morning's dead, that the Corsair belonged in the second category. The change in Japanese language after this kind of encounter tells the truth more clearly than any performance chart. At first they laughed at the shape, then they discussed the speed. Soon after, they warned about the dive, then about the armament. Finally, they began treating the silhouette itself as a signal that the fight must not be mishandled. That is the progression from contempt to respect to caution. Fear is rarely the first word. It is often the last. Rayner's squadron would keep learning, keep losing men, keep getting better. Some of the lessons were written in tactics. Others were written in funerals and repairs. Yet that first real battle remained different because it answered the only question that matters when a new aircraft reaches war. Not whether it can fly, whether it can change how the enemy thinks. The Corsair had done that before lunch. By the time Japanese veterans passed their warnings to newer pilots, the wording had changed from mockery to caution. Do not chase too long. Do not force the vertical carelessly. Do not assume the big one must turn. Do not expect damage to end it quickly. Those warnings are the real monument to the first engagement. Men do not rewrite their caution notes for airplanes they consider jokes. They rewrite them for threats that have already cost blood. The Corsair's legend would later include island campaigns, carrier service, marine aces, night fighting, close support, and every other kind of proof war can demand. Good. It earned them. But legends usually begin in smaller places than memory allows. They begin in the private shame of a veteran pilot discovering he has mocked the wrong machine. They begin in a ground crewman, seeing the pilots walk toward an aircraft differently after one mission. They begin in one fight, changing the argument. So the title is true, in the only sense that matters. Japanese pilots mocked the Corsair because they were reading the airplane with old eyes. They saw size where they should have seen potential energy. They saw awkwardness where they should have seen structural confidence. They saw a fighter that looked wrong and assumed wrongness was weakness. Then one engagement taught them the dangerous possibility every war eventually uncovers. Sometimes the ugliest machine owns the cleanest answer. Over the Solomons, under a sky already crowded with old reputations, the Corsair did not ask to be admired. It arrived, refused the wrong fight, struck hard in the right one, and left Japanese pilots carrying a new problem back to base. They would meet the aircraft again, and learn more each time. But the first lesson remains the most expensive. Do not laugh at a fighter that climbs out of its own dive like that. The Marines who flew it learned something just as important. The Corsair was not there to prove American pilots could win the Japanese dogfight. It was there to end the dogfight's monopoly on what winning looked like. That is a bigger achievement than one morning's score. That is a shift in the sky's grammar. And when grammar changes in war, old masters become hesitant readers. Sato had entered the engagement trusting his eyes, his training, and the Zero's familiar authority. He left it with all three intact and yet diminished. He could still fly beautifully. He could still kill careless men. But now one American aircraft had inserted uncertainty into the beginning of every future approach. That uncertainty would cost Japan more than one burst ever could. It would cost decision speed. Rayner entered the same engagement uncertain in himself, and uncertain in the aircraft. He left it no wiser in the dramatic sense. Still young, still frightened, still capable of terrible mistakes, but armed with a colder confidence. He now knew the Corsair's promises were real if he behaved like a steward of them instead of a gambler. That is how pilots become dangerous, not when fear leaves them, when evidence stays with them. Mallory, who never shot anyone and never climbed into the sky, understood the battle in the most practical way of all. He looked at the returning aircraft, counted the holes, counted the belts spent, counted the men who came back. Then he looked at the way the pilots talked around the Corsairs that afternoon, and knew the machine had passed the only test mechanics truly respect. It had changed the confidence of the men who had to bet their lives on it. And somewhere across the water, Japanese maintenance crews were listening to their own pilots use a new tone when they mentioned the bent-wing American fighter, not hysteria, worse, professional seriousness. When professionals stop joking about a machine, the war around that machine has already shifted. By dusk, the Corsair still looked strange parked on the strip. Its nose still seemed too long. Its wings still seemed to bend in the wrong places. Its stance on the ground still carried a hint of awkwardness, like an athlete wearing the wrong clothes. Yet after that morning, appearance had lost jurisdiction. Men on both sides now knew the aircraft's true shape existed only in motion, and in motion, it was all verdict. That is why one fight changed everything. Not because it made the Corsair invincible, not because it erased the Zero's virtues, because it destroyed the first easy lie about the airplane before the Japanese could settle into it. The new American fighter was not too big to matter, too clumsy to fear, or too crude to master the Pacific sky. It was something rarer and harder to answer. A machine whose power arrived with a doctrine.